Good morning, Sebi. How are you?
Good morning, Jamie. I am well, thank you. What about you?
Yeah, very good. Thanks. Very good. Thank you so much for making the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. And we've talked before about this concept of Sentientism, which frames the series, and it's focused on answering those two deep philosophical questions. What's real? How should we understand the universe? And what matters morally? So I've got an obvious bias, given I'm trying to raise awareness of and develop and build community around this sentientism idea. But in short, it says we should be committed to evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. Use evidence and reason to understand the world and have compassion for all sentient beings, any being that is capable of experiencing suffering. But I'm having conversations in this series with people who agree and disagree with that philosophy. So it'll be fascinating to understand your personal journey. But before we get onto those questions, how would you best introduce your life and your work?
Thank you for having me on. So currently, I'm a PhD candidate at the Environmental Governance and Politics Department at Radboud University in the Netherlands. And I came about to this position in a bit of a roundabout way. I spent 7 years actually in London, in the city, working in much more of a corporate job, financial PR and investor relations. And it got to that stage in life where people are settling down, buying houses, and I had the opportunity to pursue academia or carry on in the corporate world. And really, I always had a passion for the academic world, and I did want to carry on. And so I made that leap and I quit my job. And through fate or luck, I met someone who was doing a master's in Amsterdam. And the course was Global Environmental Governance. And I thought, well, that sounds perfect. That sounds just exactly what I'd be interested in. So after a 10-minute conversation with this person, I looked up this course and applied and ended up in Amsterdam. So a few years ago, I did my master's as a mature student in Amsterdam. And yeah, I wanted to continue my academic journey. And then the sort of perfect PhD position came up, which is looking at animal and biodiversity governance. So that's what my research is focusing on now. It's looking at the relationship between animal governance systems. So that's more the livestock and domestic animal governance systems that focus on individual animal health, welfare, and rights. And then the biodiversity governance system. So that's really conservation, and that looks more at a species level. And so I'm researching how these two governance systems link, their relationships between them, or if there is any link, because actually they seem quite separate: biodiversity conservation and how we think of species, and then also how we think of individual animals and livestock.
Yeah, fascinating. It's quite a radical switch from the corporate world to the academic.
Yeah, it really was. It was radical in terms of, job description. But personally, it wasn't that much of a shift because I already was very intrinsically interested in environmental issues. So it was more aligning more with my personal values.
Yeah. And focusing on those rather than having to squeeze it around the edges of the day job. So
Exactly. And well, you work just as hard in academia, or if not harder, than in the corporate world, because you really care. Most academics, they really care about their field. So it's not just, oh, can I get to the end of the day? It's not, I can never do enough to learn about this topic and to understand it.
Yeah. And for the academics I've spoken to in this series, it seems almost doubly true because one, there's that intellectual drive to understand, but for people who work in the fields of morality, ethics, ecosystems, animals, human animals, there's a sort of activist commitment there as well for many of them as well. So yeah, there's an intensity to it. And I think we'll come back to those themes of governance in the sort of ecosphere and around animals as well. Of course, we talk about how the future might play out. But before we get to that, it would be fascinating to know your own personal philosophical journey with respect to these two central questions. So the first one really is, again, crazily open and very basic, but what's real? So for many people, that's a story about whether they grew up in a naturalistic, science-focused, atheistic sort of household and society, or one that was more spiritual, more supernatural, more religious, and how their philosophy has shifted over time, if it has, on that side of philosophical thinking. But yeah, it'd be great to know your story.
I grew up in the UK, as you can probably hear from my accent, in Surrey, so south of England. And it was very much a sort of traditional, so to speak, English upbringing. There was religion at school. It was sort of Christian school. We sung hymns and there were prayers, but I wasn't a religious person and we weren't a religious family. Maybe we'd go to church on Christmas Day, but apart from that, religion wasn't a large factor in my life growing up. So I suppose, like you say, it was more of a naturalistic upbringing. But very early on, I had this affinity with nature and the natural world. And I remember going consciously vegetarian when I was about 6 years old. I was on Guildford High Street in Surrey, and there was a stand, and I think it was Viva, Vegetarians International Voice for Animals. And they had some leaflets and some pictures. And that was the first time that I realized and associated that animals that I loved were ones that we would be eating. And the knowledge that my actions could be causing suffering and harm to another being, I couldn't abide by that. So I went vegetarian. I'm sure my parents thought it was a phase, but yeah. And as I got older, it evolved, as I think a lot of vegetarians evolved from, I don't want to hurt another living being, to the idea that these lives are so commodified, especially in industrial agriculture, the thought of as a number really, or how much profit can I make? And so that commodification of a life is quite abhorrent to me. So that's how my thinking evolved. And also growing up in the countryside in the UK, I was surrounded by a lot of people that were into sort of countryside pursuits, hunting, fox hunting, or shooting. And again, these ideas to me as a child, they really didn't sit very comfortably. So that's how my thinking started to evolve on these sort of issues that we're talking about, sentience.
And it's pretty bold to make that shift at 6 years old. It's one thing to think that way and feel it, but I think most people, or many children, have that sensation when they think about these things, but then quite firmly pushed back into place by family and social norms and some deliberate cognitive dissonance of just, let's try not to think about, eat your bacon sandwich. But, so it's quite bold. What sort of response did you get from your family to that decision?
I think they weren't particularly supportive, but they also didn't disregard it. And well, I don't know how I survived my childhood because I mostly just ate pasta or cereal, but it seemed to work for me. And so they accepted it. So I didn't have any pushback from that. So I suppose I'm lucky in that sense.
So that seems like that's almost the second question really about what matters and morality, was one that I guess had compassion at its heart and was wanting to avoid harming in a sense. And is it fair to say that, as you said, as a young person, you already thought in quite a naturalistic way? So there wasn't really a sort of religious or a supernatural underpinning to that morality. It was just a sense of compassion and not wanting to cause harm. Is it that simple? Yeah,
I think so. And now you're putting it like that obviously I had this sort of naturalistic mindset, and maybe now I've shifted more onto the spiritual side because I do a lot of yoga as an adult since I was 18. And so now my morality is a lot underpinned by Eastern philosophy and obviously the teachings in yoga as well. So what's real has shifted a bit. It still is compassionate, but maybe there's different motivations for the compassion and understandings.
That's interesting.
That there's a saying in yoga, Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. I don't know if you've heard this one before. It always spoke to me whenever a yoga teacher said it. It means, may all beings be happy and free from suffering. And then also may the words and actions, thoughts, words and actions of my life contribute to the happiness and freedom for all. So that always, that spoke to me. And
hard to argue with that.
It influenced my thinking, in the last decade or so.
Yeah. And going back to those early days, I think it sounds like your sort of context around religions, the supernatural, was pretty similar to mine. It was a sort of fairly anodyne, pretty background, sort of Anglican English Christianity. Didn't really intrude into your life that much, wasn't that meaningful. But there is a difference. So when I was growing up in that context, again, it wasn't a central part of our lives, church and Easter and Christmas, and that was pretty much. But I did actually believe, so until I was maybe, 12, 13, 14, something like that, I did have this sense that there is a deity out there. And, I didn't necessarily believe all of the tenets of Christianity, but it was a sort of default thing that I held on to. And then I went through a process in those early teen years of looking at different religions, learning about the history of religion, thinking, hold on a minute, these seem very much like human fabrications. And also looking at the ethics of them all and saying, okay, there's some compassion here, of course, but there's also some bloody awful stuff, right? Sexism, homophobia, other things I just thought ethically threatening your children with eternal hellfire and damnation didn't seem to be that compassionate to me. So there was both on the sort of facts of the matter and the ethics that drew me away from it. And it was reasonably easy because it wasn't that deep in our culture, but it still took me a few years to really come to terms with it. And I went through a process of, which I think is fairly common, of saying, okay, I'm going to let the formalized religion go, but I still have a sense that there's something out there. Maybe it's not the Christian God, but there is some transcendent thing. And then I basically worked through that and have ended up a pretty hard-edged naturalistic person now. I'm open-minded, but I think it's vanishingly unlikely that there's anything like a personality or a construct or some sort of external teleology to the universe. I think it's matter and energy and information processing, and that's it. And there's plenty of awe and wonder in that. But anyway, that's enough about my perspective. But it's interesting the way you describe your journey, because quite a few of my guests have followed my path. They've gone from a religion to a sort of naturalistic approach, but quite a few have taken a naturalistic path, but then also, as you hinted at, started to explore different versions and approaches to spirituality as well. And for some of them, that has gone back to more of a supernatural, transcendent something else. And for others, it's still been quite naturalistic, but it has taken elements of, Buddhist philosophy and ways of thinking about the world and a naturalistic appreciation of our connectedness and the cycles and the systems we're all part of as well. So it'd be interesting to know a little bit more about your thinking. How would you describe what you think the nature of reality is, and whether there are things beyond the purely physical and so on?
Yeah, I think I also went through that transition period like you, definitely more, teenage years. I had more of an aversion to the word God and how these were socially constructed religions. And so I was atheist. And then as I've become older, I suppose I realize how little I do know, how little we all know. And so more into an agnostic space. And I don't know. So I can't say for certain that there's nothing else there. And when I got to Amsterdam, I also, through luck or something, I managed to end up working for a psychedelic therapy company. And a lot of people involved in psychedelics, there's a connection to a oneness. They feel there's a spirituality. So perhaps I've also been influenced by that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I quite like the definition of atheism, which doesn't talk about being 100% sure there's no God. It just says, I don't have a belief in there being one. So in that definition of atheism, nearly all agnostics are atheists as well. And that's one of the things that this series of conversations has helped me with as well, is that of course, there can be lots of dogma in a religious way of thinking, but there can also be dogma in a naturalistic way of thinking. And you can get that tone from some of the more militant atheists, for example. And sometimes I have to admit I am one, because it can almost sound like we're so confident of the truth that it's 100%, it's proven, it's definite, it's the end of the conversation. Whereas the essence of a naturalistic way of thinking has to be open-minded, because as soon as you're 100% confident of anything outside of a formal system, you're closed to new evidence and you will not reconsider. So it's classic Bayesian thinking that we should hold our beliefs probabilistically and provisionally. And that means acknowledging that even potentially crazy sounding ideas might be true and we should be open-minded. But the critical thing for me is being open-minded, but not granting credence in something until the evidence is there. And that's one of the challenges I find, both for people who have a traditionally religious view, but many people who follow a spiritual path, where there's a sense of, okay, I have this radical open-mindedness, and then there's this sort of wishful thinking that leads them to granting credence for things for which there is no basis. And I think there's a big difference there between I'm open-minded, these things could be true, and actually saying, this is now my belief system and I'm convinced that these fantastical things exist. So it's a tricky balance, I think, maybe.
I was going to get onto it later, but the Convention on Biological Diversity has something called the precautionary principle.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've come across this before, and it says that if there's biodiversity loss or a threat to biodiversity, you don't need evidence to act. You can act before evidence. So this is how it's almost applied at the international level. The not knowing is not a reason not to act on something.
And knowing doesn't have to be binary. It's not I know it or I don't know it. It's about I have a 74% credence that this thing may or may not be true. It's a good thing that probabilistic knowledge and belief is good enough to take decisions on sensibly, because frankly, that's all we've got. If we're waiting for a perfect proof, we're going to be waiting a long time. Yeah, so it's interesting to hear where you've found that balance. And one of the other things that I find fascinating, and this is the link between these two central questions we're discussing, what's real and what matters, is how those frames of thinking, supernatural, religious, spiritual, naturalistic, influence and morality. And I guess my primary concern is, in a sense, I'm pretty relaxed. If people want to believe what they want to believe, that's absolutely fine. I'd like them to be better correlated with reality if possible, but if not, it's a free world and people should be able to believe what they want to believe. I guess my primary concern is where belief systems then start warping or undermining compassionate ethics. And so that's one area I'm interested in, is how those worldviews then link to ethics. So there are some obvious ways that those things can be problematic. So a religious worldview can have in-groups and out-groups. They can override compassion with a deity's obedience to a deity or a list of rules. So you can be a compassionate person, but if God tells you to kill your own child, you have to do it. Those types of things. But at the same time, in a religious worldview, there's a lot of positive ethics that flow through. There's universal compassion and love almost being the point of everything and so on. So there's good and bad. In a broader, more sort of spiritual, transcendent, supernatural worldview, and some of the Eastern philosophies, again, I think there's good and bad there, because there's a lot of good in terms of recognizing the suffering of others, being motivated by that quote to, assuage the suffering of others, some deep thinking about how the way our own minds work can be the source of much of our suffering, our desires and our wants and our drives, and how to mitigate that. So there can be a lot of value there. And also this sense of everything is connected and we're all really part of the same thing. And therefore caring about others is, in a way, caring about you. So there's lots of powerful things. But at the same time, that sort of broader spiritual, systemic thinking, holistic thinking also can lead to some pretty dodgy ethics, in my view, as well, that undermine compassion. So I've had conversations with people where they'll say, I have this rich transcendent sense that we are all connected. We are all ultimately one. We are part of a natural system. Life is life. And as part of the cycle of life eats life. So I'm quite happy having my bacon sandwich. And I'm like, hold on, that sounded really nice until the point where you needlessly caused harm to another sentient being. Yeah. So I should stop talking now, but that's my sense, that both types of supernatural worldview can have good elements of ethics, but also some that undermine this universal compassion I'm trying to push for as well. So I'm interested in how your core of compassion seems to have stayed consistent through, your early days, your atheist days, and now when you're thinking maybe more open to Eastern philosophy and spirituality. But I'm interested in how
all of those elements have combined, and then to make it even stronger, the sense of compassion, because you have all these different elements and all of them are underpinned by compassion. And perhaps it's my personal take, but I take what I think is appropriate from each of the different aspects and apply them in my life to how I live. Yeah, so that's how I've done it anyway. But
and it feels like, I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but it almost feels like this compassion for you is almost the center, and the other thinking you've done, you've drawn in to support it. It almost feels like nothing could really shake that conviction that compassion is important.
I suppose it's, as we were talking about at the beginning, it's what I've believed in or been grounded in since a child. So I suppose it would be difficult to shake it, but as you say, you always have to be open to new evidence. Yeah.
The second question, which we've touched on richly already, about what matters and what is the grounding of morality. And I think you and I share that sort of sense of compassion and the fact that we care about other beings that can suffer, and we care about that suffering. We care about that experience. And one way you might describe that is almost on a spectrum of which entities do you grant moral consideration for. And there's different ways of describing this, but one might be anthropocentrism, where we focus on really only humans matter. Then I guess there is sentiocentrism, which I'm saying the naturalistic version of is sentientism, which is where we care about all beings that have a capacity to experience particularly suffering and flourishing. And so some people will challenge a sentiocentric or a sentientist worldview and say, look, you've gone too far, only humans matter, or humans matter to the extent so much that we should really focus on non-humans. And you can justify that in a religious or a supernatural way. We have dominion over animals, we have souls, animals don't, so on. Or you can justify it in a sort of, I would argue, a warped scientific way of saying humans have these capabilities that other animals don't have, and therefore we can needlessly harm and kill them. So that's one challenge to sentientism, which I think you and I would both disagree with. But there's also a challenge that goes the other way. And we touched on this in our previous conversation, and it's partly how we ended up talking in the first place, which is some people will say, look, sentientism doesn't go far enough. And actually, we need to have a consideration for all living beings. Biocentrism is one way of describing that, where we care about plants as well, and anything that, arguably even bacteria, right? Anything that's living matters. And you can go even beyond that to a more ecocentrism or a holistic point of view, where you say, no, actually, the entire system matters, including rocks and rivers and trees and ecosystems and Gaia and species. So how do you think about the further end of that spectrum, going beyond sentience?
Yeah, the dichotomy between environmental ethics and animal ethics is one that's discussed a lot in literature. And I've recently contributed to a chapter in a book which is coming out about transforming biodiversity governance. And we argue for more of a combination of the ecocentric rights of nature approach and the animal rights and compassionate conservation approach if we want to reduce biodiversity loss, as we're in the sort of sixth mass extinction. So perhaps there is some way of combining them, but of course they are opposites in some ways. You have the sort of species level thinking and then the individual thinking. And right now, as I'm working on invasive alien species governance and looking at how these animals are governed as species predominantly, and obviously they're labeled in a very negative way, and that sort of sanctions and warrants our management of them in a way that we would never do for other animals. There are some animals that straddle the divide. So cats, for example, they are pets, they have economic and cultural and personal value to us, but also they are an invasive species that kill native biodiversity. So that's an interesting dilemma. But other species, invasive species, they don't get the same attention. Yeah. So there's definitely a difficult dichotomy between environmental ethics and animal ethics. And there's going to be no easy answer or road that unifies them completely. But I think, as I've heard you talk on other podcasts, sentience is an important grounding for our actions. And because there is more evidence of the sentience and the feelings of animals, non-human animals, perhaps this should be prioritized over the environment as a whole. But then, of course, you can argue from the other point of view that the environment as a whole, it supports these non-human animals.
Yeah.
And we are all connected in that way. So we need to have regard for that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in a way there are different ways of thinking, but there can be very common conclusions, because my concern for sentient beings leads me to a very rich appreciation of the value of ecosystems and biodiversity and habitats and the earth as Gaia, or however far you want to go. But that concern is motivated completely by the fact that it's important for the sentient beings. And sometimes it seems, does it really matter whether we're granting instrumental value to these non-sentient beings or intrinsic value to these non-sentient beings? And it can sound like quite a technical discussion. Does it matter as long as they're important? And there's something to that. But part of the reason I think it's important, again, is because if someone genuinely intrinsically grants moral value to beings that aren't sentient, there's a real risk we end up needlessly harming sentient beings because we just see in a ridiculously silly way, here's a carrot, here's a chicken, I've got to eat. So there's almost two ways of doing this. One is the trolling of vegans on Twitter, where people just say, oh, plants are sentient too, and I have to eat, so I might as well eat a sentient being. But there's also an academic version as well, where people genuinely are biocentric and ecocentric and say, no, these ecosystems matter in their own right, and matter so much that it's actually justifiable to harm and kill or cull vast swathes of sentient beings. And so that's where I think this intrinsic instrumental distinction does become important, because if your granting of biosystem and ecosystem worth is purely instrumental, you never forget that the reason you're doing it is because of the sentient being. So you come back to one of the suggestions you made to me in our conversation was compassionate conservation, where yes, it's about conserving the environment, but it's driven by a motivation and a compassion for each individual sentient being as well. So that's the balance.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that point. I definitely think maybe sentience can be a reason to prioritize these beings over the inanimate objects. I'm dreading when the science comes out saying that carrots have feelings, because what am I going to eat then? But
but I think that's a fair point, right? Because one of the irritating things about sentientism is it's very neutral on so many things, right? So it doesn't have a list of which things are sentient. It just says follow the science. So yeah, absolutely. If some science comes through that shows that plants are meaningfully sentient, we can assess the degree of that, but it would have deep implications for our morality. Now, my understanding of plant anatomy is that's vanishingly unlikely to happen. But yeah, absolutely. Let's be open-minded. Let's just keep following the science.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But so that is fascinating. And in a way, that links quite nicely onto the final question, which is about the future. And on the one hand, I think this sort of generally naturalistic approach, which uses evidence and reason to probabilistically and provisionally and prudently understand the world, seems like a sensible way forward. And the approach that I think you and I take, where we recognize that all beings that are sentient, regardless of species or characteristic or race or class or sexuality, all matter morally, and we should ideally have compassion for them, makes sense too. But largely because of the way people are brought up and social norms, both of those things are undermined in the minds of most people around the planet. And that's led to many of the issues that you work on and many of the problems for us as a species and for non-humans as well. So in that sort of weird context, how do you think about the future, either from a sort of utopian sci-fi point of view, where, if people were more naturalistic and they were more broadly and generously compassionate for all sentient beings, what sort of future could we get to? But also more pragmatically, what sort of things do you think we can do now, given the weirdness of human psychology and the complexity of the world, to try and make the world a better place for sentient beings? It's another crazily big question, but...
Yeah, I certainly think that the sort of hegemonic anthropocentrism is very damaging to these other non-human animals and the way we treat them. From a sort of pragmatic perspective, we're starting to acknowledge animal sentience. In the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, the EU acknowledges animal sentience, but it's still from an anthropocentric perspective. It's saying we recognize when formulating policies that animals are sentient beings, but we still have to respect member states' cultures and customs. So it's still from an anthropocentric perspective. And even last week, I think that the UK now has an animal sentience bill. So it's still acknowledging sentience, but from an anthropocentric perspective. So what I'm working on now, what I'm working on with my supervisor, who has a paper coming out soon on transformative governance, is how can we transform from the society we're in now to where we want to be. And transformative governance, it needs to be integrative and inclusive, informed and adaptive. And it's tackling really the root causes, the sort of indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So these can be economic, socio-cultural, demographic trends. Of course, this does require an entire system change. We can't carry on and make the changes necessary if we're to survive as a human species and if other species are to survive in the way that we've been doing. And my research at the moment about these invasive species, so these are species that are deemed a threat because they've spread outside their natural past or present range. But who's to decide? Why are we to decide what is their past range, and what's the time scale? Because it's quite arbitrary, really. And if it's in the last 200, 300 years, humans can definitely be thought of as an invasive species.
Ultimately, we're the most invasive species there is.
Well, exactly. We're causing more damage to other biodiversity and species than any other. So still this anthropocentric thinking is ingrained, obviously. So I actually read a great book by Chris Thomas. It was called Inheritors of the Earth. And in it, he argues that invasive species are actually going to increase biodiversity. Yes, you might lose some of your favorite natives, but realistically, with climate change, with habitat loss, some species are not going to be able to survive at all, and some won't be able to survive in their present range. So perhaps they will have to migrate. Yeah, so I think we need to shift our thinking from this anthropocentric perspective. What it looks like the future, I don't actually have an answer.
One interesting thought experiment, and this is another thing that led to us being in contact in the first place through your work and Ingrid's work, was as you're thinking about a more holistic, non-anthropocentric governance model, how much can we just copy paste what we've done for humans? So we've gone through this halting, imperfect, still incomplete journey with human morality, where at least in concept, after the Second World War, nearly every country signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and said, we're still screwing all sorts of things up. We have all sorts of problems, but at least in concept, we're putting our arms around the entire human species and saying everybody matters, and arguably everybody matters equally. And we've, through the Millennium Goals and through setting the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, again, we've imperfectly, with loads of mistakes, but at least conceptually laid out, here's a framework for what's important and how we're going to move forward and what we're going to try and do collectively, which we can all criticize, of course, and we should. But for a population of 7.8 billion autonomous sentient beings, it's quite amazing for us to have got to that stage, even in concept. So as a thought experiment, how much of that stuff can we just take the word human and replace it with sentient being and see what happens? Or how much do we need something that's, even more radically different?
Yeah, it's difficult. It reminds me a bit of Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach, which she obviously wrote for humans and then said, actually, well, it can be applied to non-humans with a few tweaks. And also in the sort of animal rights literature, there's also a debate, can you just translate human rights to animal rights? They are different entities, and what they need, what they should be granted as rights is maybe not the same as what we need as rights.
And there's a danger of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism in just assuming that they need what we need. Yeah,
exactly. And the Sustainable Development Goals, another paper that Ingrid Visser, my supervisor, wrote, is about having an 18th Sustainable Development Goal. So there are 17, and they're all, how can we have a sustainable future for humans? And people think that animals are included, and they are under some of them, but as species, they're not included. Their rights and their welfare and their health as individuals is not included in them. So that would have to be reframed.
And I think there's a tricky balance here, because on the one hand, we can be understandably so nervous about our own anthropocentrism that we almost give up. We say, look, who's to know what's in the best interests of non-humans? Let's just step aside. And you'll see that even within the animal advocacy and the vegan movements, when they're thinking about wild animal suffering, they're almost just, humans are dangerous, humans are the virus, humans are invasive. Let's just leave the wild alone completely. At the same time, completely ignoring the vast amounts of suffering that go on in the world. So in the way, that sort of fear of anthropocentrism can lead us to disengage and maybe not even try, which I find depressing. But on the other hand, you're right, we can't be oversimplistic and just assume that what non-human species want and need and what's in their interest is the same as what we need. So it's a tricky balance. But I've done two silly things, really. One, and this is, again, the link to the 18th SDG question, because instead of adding an 18th SDG, I had an amateur go at reworking all of the 17 SDGs and just building non-human animals into them. And it was remarkably easy. It just fitted. You could just extend the concept of getting rid of discrimination to include species. You could extend the protection to water and waterways to actually recognizing that the fish themselves matter. So it was actually reasonably easy to extend it. And another silly thing I did was taking the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and rewriting it as a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. And what I found is that, of course, there are certain types of rights that are relevant to humans, to an education or certain other things that are less relevant to non-humans. But the most important ones were totally common. So when we're thinking about the most, even as humans, the things that are most important to us, right? The right to life, the right to be free from physical harm, the right to family and connections and relationships, the right to sustenance and shelter and food and water. So, yep. So in a way, I think it's right to be skeptical and cautious, but at the same time, we can have confidence that because we have an evolutionary history we share with non-human animals, the most basic rights, needs, interests, and wishes and desires are actually remarkably common. So I was quite surprised in those thought experiments of how easy it was to just push beyond the human boundary and use a lot of the great thinking we've done to say, maybe there's an answer here. So I don't know if do you think that's a viable way forward, or do you think it's breathtakingly naive? Or
no, I think there's obviously the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and there were some organizations that still are trying to write a universal declaration of animal welfare, not animal rights, but animal welfare, the UDOR. I think that's tricky ground because animal welfare has many different conceptualizations and is a bit tarnished, I would say, because animal welfare is used by animal agriculture to show that, pseudo show that they have a care for the animals that they are looking after. But I attended a webinar recently. It was a animal welfare, and it was by the dairy industry. And I was really shocked actually about how captured by corporate interests just the concept of animal welfare is. And they use euphemisms like when the cow leaves the herd, and they had this whole graph of when the cow leaves the herd, which was about 5 years.
Yeah.
Obviously, the cow's natural lifespan, I think, can be 15 years.
Yeah. So, but when the productivity drops off, they leave the herd.
Well, exactly. When they're not yielding enough milk. Yeah. Translating these human concepts to animal concepts, if that is a way that helps people understand and expand their circle of moral compassion, then why not use it? The sort of framework I'm using for my research at the moment is pragmatism. Yeah. So you pick and choose from different theories and different things, whatever works. And that will be different in different places in the world. The idea of multi and interspecies justice, where the interests of all animals matter, not based on our subjective and arbitrary distinctions. Well, you don't want to neglect the spiritual and the cultural, because otherwise we're reducing our worldview to maybe our dominant Western cultural spiritual forms, which are sustaining these narrow conceptions of justice, maybe neglecting indigenous views. So perhaps we can get to this world of expanded compassion, but maybe there are different paths to it. We don't want a homogenized world, but there are different pathways to compassion and acknowledging sentience.
Yeah. And does that concept of pragmatism link to the idea, I guess, an idea of pluralism as well, where there are many different ways of approaching the problem, or different contexts that people operate from, or different ways of thinking? Yeah. I think that's enormously powerful. And the only caveat for me is that that's partly why I framed Sentientism as a very basic platform, if you like. It's just naturalism and it's just sentiocentrism. And then beyond that, it's radically pluralistic. There are so many other things to fight over. And my only hesitation with this sort of pluralistic approach is that it doesn't bleed too far into what becomes a relativism. And you can see that in some contexts where people are actually using maybe an indigenous way of life or an indigenous way of thinking or a Western colonial way of thinking to justify needlessly causing harm or death. And in a way, that's my baseline. It's like let 1,000 flowers bloom, massive cultural diversity of approaches and ways of knowing and thinking. But at no point should any of those be allowed to justify the needless suffering or death of a sentient being. So it's almost like setting that safety mechanism, if you like, to say, go for your life, be as radical as you want, but let's try and set that baseline.
But who's going to impose that baseline?
And the reality is, of course, we can talk about the theory of morality as much as we like. In practical terms, it comes back to your pragmatism, right? It's a question of negotiation and discussion and political power and how those things play out. And that's just the practical reality of how law and regulations and systems of governance get negotiated and developed. So who knows? But I do think in the same way as collectively, most people on the planet have recognized the validity of human rights. Most people on the planet recognize that it is appropriate for laws to constrain humans from needlessly harming or killing each other, that we can extend that concept and argue and eventually have it accepted that law and regulations and systems of governance could also be used in a naturally extended way to defend and protect all sentient beings, not just those of us that happen to be human or fit in the category, as you said, that we've designed to serve our own ends.
Indeed. It sort of reminds me of post-humanism. There's a great scholar called Rosie Braidotti, and she talks about post-humanism and feminism, how this deconstructs the species supremacy and the boundaries. So we're not thinking of humans and animals. It's more, I suppose that's more
exactly.
relational way of thinking.
And I think some of that work is fascinating. But again, there is always a risk still that it goes too far beyond sentience and therefore ends up justifying in some systemic way the harming and killing of others. So I found this a brutal example. Recently, I read an anthropology paper where they were talking about an experience of a farm and a slaughterhouse in India. And one of the concluding comments was something along the lines of, so they described the process of this particular cow being taken from the herd and killed, but they described it in a way that implied this process was done with reverence for the life in a traditional setting, full of care. And one of the concluding comments was something along the lines of, maybe one day even the slaughterhouse will become a place of universal care and compassion. And I'm thinking, my brain has just exploded. What? Anyways, you get my point, right? There's this sense of if something's done with reverence in a sort of warm cultural context where it's just another anthropocentric way of us justifying needlessly causing harm for our own ends. And that's why we need that.
It doesn't make it right. Yeah, I suppose my more utopian view of the future is that we're living in these increasingly urbanized societies. So we're losing this connection with nature, and it's more important than ever. And going back to what we spoke about at the beginning with the psychedelics and the connectedness with nature, there's an author that writes on this, Sam Gandhi, and that can, I'm not saying everyone should go out and take psychedelics, but it opens people's eyes and it reconnects them sometimes to something that they've lost, which a lot of us humans have lost. So, a bit like Huxley, it can open our doors of perception to understanding the importance of sentience and compassion for other sentient beings.
Yeah, agree. And I think there's a lot of connection between people who follow that path to that sense of connection and wonder and awe. And I think even without that, having taken that path, I feel many of those things as well. Just thinking about physics and the connectedness of all things and the cycles we're part of and the fact we're all stardust, I think there's a lot of commonality there. But it's still, whichever path you take, it still feels like that capacity to suffer and that sentience is something of central importance we mustn't forget. And the other thing I'm finding encouraging generally is there do seem to be cultural shifts in this direction and legal and regulatory shifts in this direction in some countries around the world. And it's always too slow and it's always partial and it's always halting, but they do seem to be moving. But there's also some really interesting thinking like yours being done about these modes of governance and all the different institutional levers and processes. So whether you think about concepts like democracy or liberalism or many of these things that we've developed for humans, again, you can quite creatively think about what would that be like if we extended it beyond humans. So you look at work like Zoopolis by Donaldson and Kimlicka, or Sentientist Politics by Alistair Cochrane, or the work that Josh Milburn is doing about liberalism and can you apply that to animals. And to most people, they'd look at that work and go, you're totally crazy. But you think it deeply enough about it and you go, well, why not, right? Why can't we just acknowledge that all suffering matters and all forms of oppression are wrong? And we're working that through for humans. It's just another step, right? So, and
I think in the future we will acknowledge more animals' own agency rather than them passive recipients. They have their own agency, and I think there's someone that talks about they do have a voice. They express themselves not in our language that we understand, but maybe we need to learn to understand the way that they do express themselves. So we need to move beyond the concept of welfare, animal welfare and sustainable use. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, there at the moment, they look at the sustainable use of biodiversity, but it's also, again, from an anthropocentric perspective, and they talk about in the context of climate change and population growth, sustainable food systems, they also need to take into consideration animal welfare. But they're talking about how this can be achieved through structured regulations and incentives and subsidies, but it's still, animal welfare sentient welfare is not right. And it still allows these things to be done, as we've been talking about.
Yeah. So, and I do find it genuinely bizarre, because when you go back to the definition of welfare, or you go back to the definition of moral consideration, or you go back to the definition of compassion, any basic understanding of those terms would completely write off the concept of farming humans. And they would also completely write off the concept of farming non-humans. Like, it's that simple, right? If you have any regard for the welfare of animals, which means caring about their well-being, you wouldn't needlessly harm and kill them, right? It's almost that simple. But as you say, these terms us humans are very good at warping and adapting these terms and coming up with categories that serve our own ends. But I think that's an interesting role sometimes the law can play, because it can actually force you to go back to those more basic definitions. And you can see some of the interesting work that's being done in India and the US and Pakistan around personhood for non-human animals, where it almost feels like the courts are saying, hold on, looking at this definition, that elephant or that gorilla or that non-human animal actually does warrant some serious consideration. And again, it feels like it's chipping away at that. That species consideration.
It's a bit like the US Constitution, and you have the different legal academics who interpret it literally as it was written, or those that actually interpret it to the context now. So some courts, maybe are literally looking at the laws and realizing, actually, there's no valid reason to withhold rights from these animals, but we can also get to it from interpreting the laws and regulations in the context now. I think we can get to it both ways.
Yeah. So with all of that said, how does that leave you feeling? Do you generally feel optimistic about where we're going as a species, or where we're going in terms of concern for other sentient beings and the world as a whole? Or are you weighed down by the challenges of human psychology and the problems we're facing, or somewhere between?
No, I think I've become more optimistic in the last few years. I've started to get involved more actually in activism. So I've been doing some protests with Animal Rebellion, the sister organization of Extinction Rebellion. And I work at a university. I see a lot of the young people are very engaged on this topic. But at the same time, I do think as humans, perhaps we're too clever for our own good.
Yeah.
And we need to tackle this sort of mental malaise, mental health disorders, especially in developed countries. They're so prevalent and becoming more so. And unhappy humans just leads to actions that we wouldn't do otherwise, because we lose compassion for ourselves and we just don't care. I don't care. It's too much of an effort to find the vegan sandwich. I'm just going to pick up the bacon one because it tastes the best.
Yeah.
So I think, we need to tackle that, the mental health crisis, basically.
That's a really important point, because in a way, that's part of the idea behind sentientism, is we should have a universal compassion for all sentient beings. So that, of course, includes all non-human animals that are sentient. It includes all humans, including the ones we disagree with, including the ones we see causing enormous harm. And that's really hard. But to your point, we need to have compassion for ourselves as well. And I think there's a positive correlation between all those things. If any one of those things falls down, maybe the others do too. Looking after ourselves is maybe central to that whole effort.
Yeah. My yoga teacher, finally the yoga studios reopened in Amsterdam. And I went to class on Wednesday, and that he used a quote from Albert Einstein, which I thought was quite nice and I think apt for this podcast. So I'll share it. It's a little, he uses he, you could put they or are. If you don't want to be sexist. But so Albert Einstein, also famously a vegetarian, said, "A human being is part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty."
That is wonderful. I hadn't heard that before. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was a good quote. He also appreciates nature as a whole, but these big philosophical and smart minds in our world, a lot of them were vegetarians. Yeah, I just like this quote that was the first quote I heard back in the yoga studio.
Yeah, that's brilliant. No, that's wonderful. Thank you. And that's one of the encouraging things I've found about developing this idea with the help of many others, is how old the roots of these ideas are, right? Whether it's a naturalistic way of thinking or whether it's recognizing that non-humans matter too. Both of those modes of thought have deep ancient roots in many cultures. And so it's encouraging to hear Einstein echoing some of those themes as well. Thank you.
Yeah. I suppose that's the part of my connection of naturalistic and also more of a Eastern philosophical spiritual side. He combines them both in that quote.
I think he does, yeah. And I think that's a productive way forward. You can still have a naturalistic approach of understanding the world, but recognizing the awe and beauty and maybe even transcendent wonder of the whole thing. So,
yeah.
Well, that's a lovely way to finish. Is there anything else you'd like to lay into the conversation?
I just suppose I'd say that I'm at a relatively early stage in my journey and my thinking is still evolving. Interview me in 5 years' time and I'll probably be in a different place and a different mindset. But I've appreciated the chance to speak with you and this conversation. And I hope what you're doing, I hope some people listen and maybe it at least makes people think and question why we do the things we do and why we think the way we think. Having an open mind, like you say, and being humble and open to new ideas and new information is surely the way that we can get to a world that we're envisioning, which, is more compassionate to all sentient beings.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's probably about 100 million or so people around the world who think this way already. Most of them haven't heard of the idea of sentientism yet. So we've got 7.7 billion left to go. But
yeah, I hope sometimes I get frustrated. There seems to be a sort of willful ignorance to ignore the things that are horrible. People know they're horrible. They don't even want to watch Seaspiracy or Cowspiracy because they know they're not going to like what they see and it's uncomfortable for them. So maybe people need to take the blinkers off and experience that uncomfortableness and realize they will have to change their lifestyle, probably quite drastically.
Yeah, agreed. And that's another thing that's flowed through these conversations. In a way, many of the technical solutions to the problems we're facing are actually fairly straightforward. It's just a question of working through this really weird, difficult human psychology and political will. And the technical answers are less of a problem. But that remains a major problem. And so thank you very much for being a tiny part of normalizing these ways of thinking and sharing your journey. And I'd love to. Let's put it in the diary for 5 years out and see where you've got to then.
Thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure. So what's the best way of people following you, finding out more about your work, keeping up to date with what you're doing?
They can find me on Twitter at Cebuan Bliss. Early next year, I think the book that I've contributed to will be coming out. That's called Transforming Biodiversity Governance. And I'm currently writing this paper on invasive alien species governance. And then I'll be moving into trophy hunting and species management, and then perhaps rewilding and de-extinction. So it takes a long time to get academic papers published. So bear with me, but they will be out shortly. So otherwise, you can find me on Twitter or feel free to email me.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Sebi. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I'm looking forward to those papers coming out, and good luck with the rest of the PhD, and enjoy the ashram this afternoon.
Oh yeah, thanks Jamie.
Yeah, cool. Take care.
Bye.